Okay, I think we can get started now. So welcome everyone, good morning to the second session in our Reducing Scope 3 Emissions series. And today we're going to be looking at category 6 of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is looking at business travel emissions. So my name is Patrick Sambach. I am a Climate Action Project Manager at the UN Global Compact Network UK. And thank you, just before I start, thank you very much to our partners for this series. So that's PA Consulting, Owen Mumford and Shoosmiths, all really valued members of the UN Global Compact Network UK. This meeting will be recorded, so don't worry about taking too many notes. We'll be sharing the recording with all of the registrants after the session is finished. A little bit of housekeeping just before we start. So if you have any questions for our panelists, please do put them in the Q&A box. So that can be found at the bottom of your screen. And anything else, so chat, introductions, networking, any links that you think might be useful, please put them in the chat box. That just helps with the moderation at the end of the session. So when we're going to the Q&A session, you can also upvote any questions which you like the look of, because ultimately I'll be taking the questions probably that have the most upvotes. Okay, so if we go on to the next slide, just a quick word on the ongoing crisis in Ukraine. So as of this morning, there's nearly 4 million refugees that have fled Ukraine, and there's an increasing need of materials and donations. So if you can help out in any way, there should be some links going into the chat now for some further guidance. Additionally, if you would like to find out some more information, if you contact us here at the UN Global Compact Network UK, we can put you in contact with Tom McKenzie from UNHCR. We do think that businesses can play a role in addressing this crisis. So yeah, as I say, feel free to follow the guidance or get in touch. Okay, so moving on to the next slide. So just a little bit about the UN Global Compact Network UK. So we're actually part of the world's largest responsible business initiative, and that's connecting companies and other organizations in a global movement dedicated to driving sustainable business. So to join the UN Global Compact, it has to be a CEO commitment, which comes from the CEO to address to the UN Secretary General. And that is to operationalize the 10 principles. It's also to report annually on progress, and also to support the wider UN development agenda. Here at the UK network, we're split into 3 work streams. So that's business and human rights, climate action, and global goals. And we deliver a range of programming over the course of the year. So I think it's up to about 100 events per year that we deliver now. So that, again, there should be some links coming into the chat. If you find any events of interest, they're all free to register for. Feel free to do so. Again, if you've got any questions about any of the events, feel free to get in contact with us. So just of note, this afternoon, we've got a LGBTIQ+ event being run. Alongside this series, we're also running a human rights and climate change series, looking at the interlinkages between the 2 topics, and a range of others as well. So if we can just go over to the next slide. I'm really pleased to introduce the speakers we've got today. I think it should be a really exciting session, a really useful session for all attendees. So we're first going to hear from Olwen Smith, and she is the UK and worldwide regional lead the Commit to Action programme at CDP, and she's also a member of the Science Based Targets Initiative corporate engagement team. She's going to be giving us a bit of an introduction into Scope 3 target setting with a focus around business travel targets. Secondly, we'll be hearing from Peter Duff, and he's the chairperson at Shoosmiths. And what he's going to cover is some information about how Shoosmiths are calculating and measuring and aiming to reduce their business travel emissions. And then finally, we'll hear from Natasha Allard, and she is Senior Manager and in charge of the Global Environment Strategy at Dentsu International. And again, she'll be talking about how Dentsu International are reducing their, measuring and reducing their business travel emissions. As I say, it should be a really good session, and we'll end up with about a 25-minute question and answer session. So as I say, any questions you have, please do get them into the Q&A box as we go through the presentations. Okay, so moving on to the next slides, last slide from me. A little bit of information, background on the business travel category, so category 6 of the corporate value chain accounting and reporting standard. So it's category 6 of 15 scope 3 categories defined in the standard. And essentially it covers emissions from the transportation of employees for business related activities in vehicles owned or operated by third parties. And there's a range of modes of transport which these emissions can arise from. Okay, so if we go on to the next slides, I'm really pleased to hand over to Olwen Smith. Olwen, over to you.
Great, many thanks, Patrick, and thank you to the UNGC Network UK for having me, and good afternoon, good morning to all of you. I'm going to start by giving you a quick introduction to the Science Based Targets Initiative, and then, as Patrick said, I'll cover Scope 3 target setting under the SBTi, but focusing in particularly on the business travel category 6 emissions. So if we can move on to the next slide, and for those of you that are less familiar with the Science Based Targets Initiative, a little bit of background on it. It was founded just before the Paris Agreement by 4 founding partner organizations, and they are CDP, the United Nations Global Compact, the World Resources Institute, and WWF. And it was really founded with the aim of driving ambitious corporate climate action by enabling companies to set emissions reductions targets that are in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement and consistent with the latest climate science. And as the numbers on the right-hand side of the slide here illustrate, the SBTi has seen really strong traction over the recent years, and particularly, I would say, in the last year to 18 months. So we now have 2,735 plus companies setting targets through the initiative. And this equates to over 38% of global market capitalization. So a lot of these are some of the largest companies in the world. So if we move on to the next slide then, and I'll just quickly explain a bit more about what a science-based target is. So a science-based target is a corporate emissions reductions target, which is in line with the level of decarbonisation that the latest climate science says we need to reach the goals of Paris Agreement, as I mentioned. Previously, this was aiming at well below 2 degrees, but we've seen from more recent reports from the IPCC that really we now need to be aiming for a 1.5 degree warming maximum if we're to avoid the most catastrophic impacts of climate change. And a quick note on the time frame then of science-based targets. There are 2 types of science-based targets. The first are those that have been around since the initiative was first founded, and they are the near-term targets. So they span 5 to 10 years. It used to be 5 to 15 years, but will soon be a 5 to 10-year maximum timeframe. And then the others are longer-term or net zero science-based targets. And these are newer types of targets which have only been starting to be validated since the start of this year, 2022. And that's since the launch of the net zero standard from the Science Based Targets Initiative, which came out late last year. So if we head on to the next slide then, and I'll start diving into Scope 3 target setting particularly. So the Science Based Targets Initiative acknowledges that there is some challenges for companies when it comes to firstly calculating Scope 3 emissions in terms of data availability and accuracy, and also knowing what levers you have at your disposal to reduce emissions across value chain. So for that reason, in the near term, there's a bit more leniency on target setting for Scope 3 when compared with Scope 1 and 2. So as this slide here shows, for a near-term target, companies need to first do a screening or a kind of rough calculation of their Scope 3 emissions. And if this shows that the Scope 3 emissions of your company constitute more than 40% of your total corporate footprint, then you will need to set a Scope 3 target. So this isn't all companies that surpass that threshold, but it is most companies. It's quite common that 40% is surpassed, and therefore a Scope 3 target will be necessary in the near term. But the next element then that there's a bit more flexibility on is the boundary of that Scope 3 target in the near term. So companies must set a target that covers at least 2/3 of their Scope 3 emissions, so 67%. And then moving on to the last point, in the near term, the minimum level of ambition for your Scope 3 target differs to Scope 1 and 2. So as of July 2022, so in a couple of months, the Science Based Targets Initiative will only accept Scope 1 and 2 targets which are in line with a 1.5-degree trajectory. However, the minimum level of ambition will continue to be for Scope 3, a well below 2-degree trajectory. So it doesn't need to be quite as ambitious a target. We would still recommend setting a 1.5-degree aligned Scope 3 target where possible, but the minimum level to have your target approved and validated by the SBTi is well below 2 degrees. And then on the final point in this slide, it's that in the near term, companies have a range of target setting methods available to them for Scope 3 target setting. So these include setting engagement targets, for example, committing to have a certain percentage of your suppliers set their own science-based targets, but you can also use absolute reduction targets in economic intensity or physical intensity. And I would recommend, I have a link in the bottom of this slide here, delving into the resources on the SBTi website to find out more about each of those target setting methods. So on to the next slide now, and looking from the near term out to the long term, and the kind of change in requirements for Scope 3 target setting between those two timeframes. So as I've mentioned, in the near term, the coverage of a Scope 3 target needs to be 2/3 or 67%. But for a longer term science-based target or a net zero target, that expands out to 90% coverage. And this is because a comprehensive target boundary is required in the long term for a company to make a really credible net zero claim at the end of that decarbonisation journey. But as I've said already, we do acknowledge that there's more challenges in the short term. So that's why we have this expansive approach. And I think it's important to say that that 90% coverage in the long term may seem challenging now, but it does also bring a lot of opportunities for collaboration across value chains. And we envisage that companies in the 2040s or 2050s, when they'll be setting these targets for, they're going to be operating within an economy that overall is much more decarbonised. On to the next slide then, and I'm going to race through this one because I think Patrick already covered it. It's just really a high level explanation of what's included in business travel as a category within Scope 3. So I'll go on to the next slide instead and focusing in a bit more on target setting, which covers this category of business travel. So there's a couple of notes here, or kind of tips for those of you that are setting targets through the Science Based Targets Initiative. So for Scope 3 Category 6 targets that cover business air travel, companies need to set an absolute contraction target, but it is advised that the target is expressed in an intensity metric. So it would read something like a commitment to reduce emissions by a certain percentage of CO2 equivalents per full-time employee. We have further guidance on how to formulate these targets in our specific aviation guidance, but the reason that we ask for this kind of standardized intensity metric is because it allows for a more efficient comparison and kind of interpretation of targets between firms. Then the next point is about including, when you are setting targets for transport related emissions, ensuring that they include the well to wheel emissions within the target boundary. And this is more more of a holistic approach, which covers the entire energy consumption and greenhouse gases of fuel from production, supply and use. The reason that this well-to-wheel approach is used is to ensure that there's an accurate capture of any emissions shifts between tank to wheel and well to tank approaches. And this could be from changing the types of vehicles or powertrain technologies that your employees are using for travel. Then the next point is just to say that hotel emissions are seen as optional under the GHG protocol for this category. And so that means that they don't count towards the 2/3 or 67% boundary of scope 3 that needs to be covered under the SBTi criteria. Then second to last, just that offsetting doesn't count as an emissions reduction mechanism under the SBTi for your near-term targets. You can't achieve a near-term target by purchasing carbon credits. It really does need to come from reducing emissions. And then finally, obviously, I think many are well aware of this, but just to take note, if you are setting targets that, of course, business travel within 2020 or 2021 might have been disrupted with COVID-19, and to take that into account when selecting your base year. So I'm almost done now, I'm conscious of time. So onto the second to last slide, which is just a couple of examples of approved near-term science-based targets, which have included business travel within them. And we have, you can see here from Deloitte, a commitment to reduce emissions from business travel by 50% per full-time employee. And then they also have, and this is to my earlier point, that you can set multiple types of scope 3 target using the various different target setting methods and approaches available. As you can see here, Deloitte has set 2 different scope 3 targets. The first one is that absolute target, and it's reducing, it's an intensity target to reduce business travel emissions per full-time employee. And the second one is a supplier engagement target. I won't run through the other 2 in detail, but I think they're helpful examples just to see how the target setting approaches are applied in practice. So onto then my final slide, which is just a summary of some of the key resources that are available from the Science Based Targets Initiative to support companies in their target setting journey. So once the slides are shared with you, I'd recommend delving into those, and looking forward to taking your questions later on. Over to you again, Patrick. Many thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Olwen. I think that's all really useful information for attendees there. Who are looking to set scope 3 targets, particularly in this category. So yeah, I'm really delighted now to hand over to Peter Duff, Chairperson at Shoosmiths.
Thanks, Patrick, and good morning, good afternoon, indeed, to some of you, seeing where some of you are. I just wanted to spend a little bit this morning talking on the journey we've been with regard to business travel, but to give you that context, just explain who Shoosmiths are. We're a primarily UK-based law firm with 227 partners, about 1,400 personnel, scattered around 13 locations within the UK, plus a small office in Brussels. So unlike Natasha, who will speak after me, who's much more internationally, our business travel is primarily within the country. We do have some flights, and I'll come on to how we're dealing with those, but just to give you that context, very much UK. If we go to the next slide, I can just again give you the context of where Shoosmiths and our own targets have been set. In 2020, so just before the Science-Based Target Initiatives were available, we set our own net zero operational targets, so scope 1 and scope 2, that we would be net zero by 2025, which suddenly seems very close indeed. And then we did go on, and we have got our near-term targets with the Science-Based Target Initiative that Olwen was talking about. And the 2 main ones for those are that we will pledge to reduce our emissions by 50% by 2030, using 2020 as our base year, and that we will increase our renewable electricity. We're currently at 74% and will be 100% by 2025. So there are overall, and obviously we need to have a look at scope 3 and where that fits. But if you go to the next slide, we can just quickly show you at the moment, and I'll explain how we're measuring, because that's the important part, I think. On scope 1, we're 35% down year on year. On scope 2, 18% down, which is, a really good start. Plenty more to be done. I think the important point, though, is that you need to be very transparent and report against these. We've been reporting actually since 2011. It was then a corporate responsibility report. Now it's an ESG report. And that gives our own employees, internal and external stakeholders, clear transparency of where we are, which of course holds us to account. And I think that's the hardest part of this, and is making sure we hold ourselves to account, which is why myself and the CEO are forefront with regard to our own journeys in sustainability, because it's important, I think, we lead from the front. Where you see for us scope 3, and that's really important because we're a professional services firm, clearly the vast majority of our emissions sit in scope 3. And we used to measure business travel, waste, water, transmission, and losses, etc. Now we're measuring home working, commuting, and the supply chain. And to give you a context, 60%, over 6% of our emissions come from purchased goods and services, with then home working number 2 and business travel number 3. But business travel is still what it was in 2019-20, 11% of our footprint. So it's something that we have more control over, and so something clearly we need to tackle. And that 11% is still a good chunk of our emissions. And we have deliberately looked at 2019-20 as a year to start from, for all the reasons Olwen said. It's pre-pandemic, it's a proper base to have a look at. So how do we measure our business travel? Go to the next slide, please. First of all, it's about data collection. And I think for those of you who are new on this journey, I think that is a critical element. It made a huge difference to us that we've started to use a centralized travel booking platform, third party. It allows us to collect data far more easily. So most of our travel gets booked now through that, which means that we do take work off our finance team, but that's more for the smaller elements, things like taxes or anything like that that can't be booked or not as easily booked through the travel portal. But what the platform gives us is a far better data set. And it means then that what we can start to do is some calculations. And there are many ways, and I'd say it was an iterative process. We use a third-party WSP to help us on our calculations, but I think they're getting better and better and more refined each year as we learn more and more. But in essence, what we look for is the kilometres travelled as a base, but we also need to know the spend and the mode of transport. And what we can then do is convert that, particularly using the mode of transport, into a recognisable, and we use the GHG protocols with regard to recognising what that carbon footprint will be. So effectively, we get to a kilometres travelled cost and recognition, and that gives us an ability to a like-for-like comparison. There are various versions available, but I think the critical thing is you must be able to do a like-for-like comparison. Otherwise, in reality, you can't start to see what difference you can make. So if you probably just end the slides for a bit, give people a rest from slides, although I apologise, that means you'll get my face up on the screen instead. What we're trying to do, actually getting Patrick's even better, what we're trying to do with us is I'm an HR practitioner by trade, so I deal with people. And what we therefore I absolutely know is you need a stick and you need a carrot. Because what we're talking about here is changing people's habits primarily. And therefore, we've got to give a framework which changes people's habits, and we've got to encourage them. But ultimately, we're going to have to force some changes. So the sorts of things we are introducing, we have a new travel policy last year, actually, was we require 1 day a week, no travel. And we encourage people not to pick Friday when they didn't travel much anyway. Pick a day you did travel and make that typically a non-travel day. We've introduced a very clear travel hierarchy. So it's a very clear expectation you use public transport first, car second, and a flight as a last resort. Clearly, we've been hybrid working for a while, but if we've not learned over the last 2 years how well we can all deal with Zoom, Teams, etc., and stop traveling, then clearly we've missed an opportunity. And I'll come back to that because I think we are at risk in some areas of missing that opportunity. So what we've also done though is some of those sticks. And there's a good example of a stick and a carrot in our travel policy. For if you book a flight, then there is a £200 levy that comes out of your own budget and goes into a carbon levy fund, which we use for carbon emission reduction. If that flight is over 4 hours, it becomes £300. So and that's not to stop people travelling. We have an office in Northern Ireland. We're not trying to isolate our Belfast colleagues. So what we are trying to do, though, is just get people to pause and think. Are you using the travel in the right way? And if you are traveling, are you bunching meetings together? Are you using the best use? Are you making sure it's a full day of meetings, or are you back-to-back days? We have various offices. I tend to now, if I am going to travel, I tend to go to one office, stay overnight and move on to another office nearby. So I'd go to Scotland for perhaps 2 days, but not go so often, so that we're trying our best to reduce, bearing in mind there's a footprint from the hotel stay as well. But equally, as I say, we're trying to do a carrot. So encouraging people onto the rail. If you travel more than 2 hours, on a train, the expectation is you'll be in first class. So we're trying to get people to recognise they can work and travel together, but still do it in an efficient way. But really, what we're going to have to do, educate. Tony Blair, a British Prime Minister some years ago, a famous quote he said was education, education, education. And I think actually it applies here. We have to give people the facts and figures, otherwise they're not going to change. So that includes giving them encouragement. The UK have a cycle to work scheme, which can subsidise purchase of bicycles. We also are about to introduce a salary sacrifice scheme if you want to buy an electric or low emission vehicle. So there's some things we can do to encourage, but a lot of it is quite simply giving the facts and figures. So that people stop and think. And I said earlier that there's a risk people go back to the old. And if you look at our flights, for example, in May to October last year, we recorded 56 flights. Not that many, but there was obviously still quite a lot of pandemic issues around. In the 3 months following that, so November to January this year, we recorded 62 flights. So in that 3 months, we've already done the 6 months of previously. So people, and I get it, there's a desire for people to go and reconnect. But we have to be really careful that people do not slip into their old habits. So I think we're going to have to push and push and push, because there isn't an easy solution. And ultimately, therefore, what we've decided as a board is for next year's budget, we have reduced the travel budget, the business travel budget, by 50% from wherever it was in 2019-20, and we are roughly the same size. So we just simply said, right, there is one thing that we can do. You only have 50% of the budget you previously had. And if you go over that, you're going to come and have to talk to us and explain why. Because ultimately, we are going to have to draw some lines. Otherwise, behaviour's not going to change. And that really, I think, is the nub of it for us. Encourage, but also give a little bit of a stick behind it. And I suspect I'll pass over to Natasha with Dentsu and the number of flights that you've got. That probably is a similar story for you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. That was great, and a really good overview of how you are measuring and addressing these emissions at Shoosmiths. So now for the final presentation before we go on to the Q&A. Natasha, over to you.
Thanks, Patrick. Thanks, Peter. Morning, afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for having me here. I'm here to talk about Dentsu International and our approach to reducing emissions from business travel. So Patrick, if you wouldn't mind going on to the next slide. Just a quick bit about Dentsu International, as many of you may or may not have heard of Dentsu International. So Dentsu Group consists of approximately 130 companies in Japan and then 900 companies outside of Japan. Outside of Japan, Dentsu International is a global advertising agency headquartered in London. At Dentsu International, we have over 45,000 people. We operate in 143 countries, meaning business travel is really important. We're headquartered in London, but we have over 300 offices in 65 countries and 11,000 clients. Next slide, please, Patrick. A bit about our net zero target. So we have 2 science-based targets. So Dentsu has a near-term science-based target to reduce scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions by 46.2% by 2030. And then a long-term science-based target to reduce emissions by 90% by 2040, both against the 2019 baseline year. Where we can't eliminate all the emissions, we will work to neutralise any residual emissions, but only the remaining 10% using carbon removal projects. And together, these commitments make up our net zero target. And both targets and our net zero target are validated by the Science Based Targets Initiative. So we were one of 7 companies to have our target validated in the Science Based Target Initiative's pilot validation phase last year, ahead of COP26. As I mentioned, the targets cover direct and indirect emissions. And when we updated our target last year, we did go through a process of recalculating some of the emissions in line with the SBTi's recommendations, including the well-to-wheel emissions that Olwen mentioned. And in order to achieve these targets, Dentsu International has started to look at the most material areas that we can change. And our business travel emissions are predominantly made up of air travel, as I imagine they will be for most or many companies on this call today. So for us, flight travel is one of those material areas. So as a step on the way to net zero, Dentsu International is also committed outside of the Science Based Targets Initiative to reduce flight emissions by 65% by 2030. And there are developments in the sector that we do hope will help us to reach this target. So it was positive to see that the International Air Transport Association announced the global air transport industry aims to reach net zero. But air travel is also expected to double, and with it, that could bring associated emissions, meaning that without achieving that plan, it could become one of the dominant drivers for climate change. And we have these strong targets ourselves, and we can't predict what will happen in the sector. But based on what we do know today and the advice of our expert consultants in this space, I'll talk you through Dentsu's approach and what we've done so far. So there are many levers that we are considering to reduce emissions from flights. Flying less is the most immediately obvious way we can reduce emissions, but flying isn't the problem necessarily, carbon is. And so it's not the only way that we're looking at reducing emissions, but it is one of them. We're a people-based business, and meeting in person won't ever be fully replaced by virtual meetings. But as an industry, we are aware that we need to change this. We do fly too much. And we have an opportunity to embed the virtual behaviours that we learned during COVID. Those new ways of working have demonstrated the value of virtual meetings, and there is an opportunity for us to travel more meaningfully. And that is something that we're actively starting to encourage. Flying economy is a less intensive way when you're calculating emissions based on a per person per kilometre basis, because you're considering the area each passenger takes up on the plane. Economy seats take up less space, so economy passengers take up a smaller share of the emissions. But our view to date has been that the real world impact of this is less, whilst the impact on our people can be significant if they're travelling on long distance flights. For flying direct, there are some different considerations. So takeoff and landing is intensive from a fuel perspective, but so can be carrying the fuel over a long distance. So again, that's not an area of focus for us at the moment. Choosing the airlines we fly with will obviously have an impact, and many of the airlines are also starting on their own journeys to net zero, some potentially committing to align with the SBTi's aviation sector guidance. Finally, sustainable fuels are a promising solution to decarbonise aviation. And just last week, I heard a great presentation from the Chief Technology Officer, at a large aerospace company, talk really passionately about the future of sustainable aviation fuels, hydrogen fuels, and battery technology. And there are positive steps moving in this direction. So the point I'm really trying to make here is that the technology and our understanding of what the levers are and that can be used to reduce emissions are constantly changing. And so at Dentsu International, we're taking all these levers into consideration. And by analysing why we fly, where we fly, how we fly, and who we fly with, we can reduce these emissions. But to do this, we know that we need better data. Next slide, please, Patrick. So what we've done is we've invested in better data to inform our decisions. Like many companies, our legacy systems are having to adapt to give us the data that we need. And in present, much in the same way that Peter and Shoosmiths calculate their business travel emissions, we're using spend data and applying an emissions factor to calculate our emissions on a kilometre basis as well. But now we're moving to a system that allows us to derive the data directly from our travel management system. So when people book their travel, so that we can have direct access to who's traveling, when, where, on wet airlines and why. And with the help of our third party Amex GBT and their algorithm, we can also calculate emissions per passenger flight more accurately, which in the future will allow our people to choose their flights more effectively based on emissions. So considering the aircraft, for example, and the configuration of that aircraft. This is now live in 3 of our countries, and we're beginning to see the data come in. And with Amex's help, we've been able to analyse some of our key routes. So, for example, there's now a very viable route from London to Amsterdam via train. But as you can imagine, and similar to Peter, taking advantage of these levers and actually implementing them does require engagement from across the business. So Patrick, if you wouldn't mind going on to the next slide. So we've established a cross-business working group. So our flights working group brings together people from a variety of roles across countries of operation. And the purpose of this group is really to enable that reduction in emissions, ultimately by providing clear policies and guidance for our people. Some of the achievements so far, so our global travel and expenses policy is being updated to incorporate aspects that will help us to deliver net zero. This is actually the second update. So the policy was first updated in 2020 when Dentsu initially set its near-term science-based target to incorporate net zero into that policy. And much like Peter, we have that travel hierarchy where we prioritise the most sustainable travel routes, so train where possible, and then flights as a last resort. We also have an absolutely wonderful lady in our travel and expenses team who has net zero built into her role. And she's factored net zero into the wider travel and expenses programme, including providing training to our EAs and PAs on how to view emissions at the point of booking. And then one of the big barriers we actually identified was that it was really hard to book train travel through our system. So she's worked tirelessly to make that available in the countries where we have it live. Individuals in our client teams have been pivotal in driving the message around more meaningful travel amongst a pilot group for one of our major brands. We have 45,000 people worldwide, so we're making sure that we get this message right with smaller groups before we roll it out to the wider groups. Traveling really to add value, not just to be seen. And the message there has been really well received from our people so far. The groups also help to remove barriers around rolling out the new travel system that will give us the data that we need to drive emissions down. And then finally, our legal team are in the process of designing supplier net zero clauses with key environmental objectives, and the test clauses have been received well so far by some of the airlines which we have existing relationships with. I'll be honest, we're still facing challenges. We've set these big targets and our people rightly want to see action. We're really balancing the groundwork, getting that right before we ask people to do something different and before communicating out to the wider business. We're not there yet, but hopefully sharing some of this information will help others on the journey as well. Thanks, Patrick, back to you.
Thank you, Tash. That was a great presentation, and yeah, again, really interesting to hear about what you're doing at Dentsu International. So just before we go to the Q&A, a quick reminder that if you can go into the Q&A box and help us out, there's so many questions in there that we're probably not going to get to them all today. So if you can go in there and upvote any questions which you like the look of, that would be really useful when we're selecting questions to be answered. So just to mention also, there have been, if you have asked a question, there may be a chance it's already been answered in typing. We've got some answers already in there that have been typed out. But yeah, okay, so thank you very much to all of you for your presentations. I thought they were all really great. The first question, which has the most upvotes at the moment from Amina, it's talking about base years. Perhaps, Olwen, could I come to you first and just ask how a company can go about setting, deciding which year to select as their base year when, particularly given there's been COVID reductions as well?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question, one we definitely hear quite often. In short, you can't have different base years for different categories. That's not permitted under the Science-Based Targets initiative, but we do have a couple of kind of principles that we recommend when choosing a base year. So obviously representativeness is important, and that's why we are seeing companies sometimes even using a slightly older base year like 2019 if it was before the pandemic, and the SBTi was allowing that due to the kind of unusual circumstances. You do also have an option, and it's not used very frequently, but companies can, if they're likely to be experiencing very high amounts of fluctuation between their emissions year to year, where you can do an average base year. So basically, say, an example, an average emissions between 2019 and 2021. And that is possible to set a target that way. So there's some more guidance on it. I'm actually happy to share maybe in the answer to this question specifically in our corporate manual. So I direct you there to look further into that.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Olwen. Tash, Peter, is there anything that you'd like to add in how you went about selecting your base year?
Well, certainly on the business travel, we did deliberately go pre-pandemic. We have got slightly different, as Olwen said, it depends on why. You know, we still had our offices, so actually for some of our emissions, they haven't changed hugely because of the pandemic, but certainly anything I think that has been improved, fortunately, by the pandemic, then yeah, we've tended to go pre-pandemic to set a baseline.
Likewise, we obviously set the target before the pandemic, so we used the best available data set that we had at the time.
Okay, great. Okay, so next I want to go to a question from Claire Elliott. So what she said is that essentially the most sustainable transport option is rarely the cheapest. So she's given an example of a cheap flight in the UK. But obviously then compared that to increasing ticket prices on trains. So she's asked, is there not a risk that by reducing your travel budget, you may actually push people to make less sustainable decisions?
Shall I take that? Because I think I might have caused that on the basis that I talked about a 50% reduction in the budget, and therefore you're right. Are you driving the wrong behaviours by taking a spend away so people go for the cheapest option? Yes, that is a risk, but that is one of the reasons why you introduced the flight levy, because actually what that does, it means it more than levels the playing field again. So you couldn't be doing it purely on the cost. Actually, we do have the issue. We have a number of our senior people just by chance live relatively close. You could get to Southampton Airport, and they often need to go to Manchester or somewhere like that. There is a direct train from Southampton Airport to Manchester, or there's a flight. One is cheaper and quicker. So we have to get to the position which is why we talk about make sure they're in first class, make sure that they're getting full use with meetings, etc., so that they are getting that train rather than the carbon footprint disaster of getting on a flight, which could have been avoided.
Patrick, I'd just add to that, the example I gave was London to Amsterdam. I think there's quite a common misconception that those trains are more expensive. We actually did a piece of analysis and we looked at flights versus trains, and actually the price was very much the same. So it's a common question that comes up internally, though. I think people even in our internal teams have the perception that flights are more expensive, but it's not always the case. And
some of it, Natasha's probably got exactly the same. The travel portal gives you CO2 information. So if you said, I want to go from London to Paris, it would tell you to be going on the Eurostar, not getting a flight. So it isn't a fix. We still give choice, but it gives you a lot of the travel portals now will give you that level of information so that you make an informed decision.
Okay, yeah, and that makes sense. And then maybe, Natasha, if I can come back to you as well on that, slightly related. You mentioned about the sustainable airlines that you were looking at. Do you have a criteria that you use for that?
So at this point in time, we're essentially gathering the data so that we can make those decisions. So we are looking at the fuel makeup of the individual airlines. We are looking at the emissions of the individual flights that people are taking. With regards to criteria, I think the challenge that we have is that it's constantly changing. So the airlines are constantly changing the fuels that they use, the planes that they use. And so we're actually looking at this on a quarterly basis, and we're working with our consultancy to make a decision on a quarterly basis, and then looking to update the system on that quarterly basis, rather than saying, you know, on an annual basis, we will be only using these suppliers. So it is a bit of an iterative process at the moment. We don't have a standard criteria now.
Mm-hmm. Peter, is there any criteria which you use at Shoosmiths?
Fortunately, I say we don't fly as much, but we are increasing at the moment. No, but what we want to do is move to that ability to be able to pick the right airline and say, I think that's, given our scale, not the information we would carry. So that has to be something that we get from a third party, and you just have to accept that, you know, you need to rely on the information coming from elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. Okay, so now we've got the most upvotes for this question, Olwen. I'm not sure if maybe you can provide an answer now, or maybe we can follow up with an answer, but it's a question from Felix about the reason why hotel emissions are optional, but well-to-tank emissions are not, when they're both optional under the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And there's a second part of the question. Are emission savings from sustainable aviation fuels, or SAFs, offsetting schemes accepted by the Science Based Targets Initiative? Is there anything you can comment on that?
Yeah, happy to. So for the first part on why there's kind of two different approaches to elements that are optional under the GHG protocol, it's basically because of the significance of fossil fuels in the well-to-wheel emissions for transport when you think about that compared to hotel emissions. And so there's a kind of bigger scope for reduction there, and it's a much more important element to include within a target boundary. So that's the kind of rationale for that differentiation. On sustainable aviation fuel, in short, yes, consumers of aviation services can rely on sustainable aviation fuel to achieve their science-based targets. I would be careful with the use of the word offsetting there. The SBTi has quite detailed guidance on it, has developed guidance on users of aviation services about kind of the different criteria for SAF. So I will pop into the chat here the link to that aviation guidance and highlight the page where you can find the more detailed information on it.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Olwen. And just following up on that as well then, so how would on the well-to-wheel aspect of the target, how would a business capture all of the data for that?
Yeah, it's a good question, but I'd actually here say I think Natasha and maybe Peter would be better placed to answer, just because the Science Based Targets Initiative, we don't generally give that kind of advisory information or guidance on the calculation piece. So we ask companies obviously to come with their inventories calculated, and then what we're looking at more is the target setting piece. But what we do is always point to the GHG protocol for the kind of official accounting standards. But when it comes to the actual practical side of capturing the data, I think, yeah, I'd see maybe does Natasha or Peter want to give their own more practical answer to how they've implemented it within their organizations.
Yeah, sure. Natasha, Peter, is anything you can add to that?
So, I mean, I think Peter and I and our companies use a very similar approach. So we take our spend-based data and we apply an emissions factor using the Greenhouse Gas Protocol guidance. And that's what we've used for our science-based targets. So for our science-based target baseline, we also included well-to-wheel calculations, again, using emissions factors. So at the moment, our reporting, at least from an external perspective, is based on that spend data. What we're doing internally to inform our emissions reduction is based on that more granular data that I mentioned earlier.
Very, very similar. Won't take up that time. Yeah, we're in a very, very similar position in the way we calculate.
Okay, great. Okay. I saw a question earlier about it's gone now in the chat, but I saw about how I know you both, Natasha and Pete, you both mentioned about how you're incentivizing, because obviously change from employees is such a big part of actually reducing emissions in this category. Could you maybe just talk again a little bit about how you're actually incentivizing employees and maybe just give a quick summary on that again?
Sure. Shall I go first? I'd say
Yes,
there's two things. One is inform, and then is incentivize, because I think there's still, I suspect that all of our personnel understand the issue. It's, it's in the news, they get it. What they probably don't understand is the granularity of how their actions can have an impact. And I think it's very easy for a lot of people to say, well, that's the firm's problem, that's the company's issue, that's nothing to do with me, when actually their decisions on how they get to work, slightly different question, but then how they travel between their offices and businesses, suddenly that's not their decision, that's the business. So one of it is to give information so that they understand the impact their decisions are having. So be very transparent and make it very clear that when they're making booking choices, or even whether or not they should be traveling, they understand what the impact is. And then the next bit then is, as I say, the stick and the carrot. So the carrot element might be small things like upgrade into a first class, because our standard travel is standard. But if you're going to travel a longer distance, yes, it's slightly higher carbon footprint, but actually that's the fair deal, because you're going to be on a train for 4 or 5 hours or whatever, and you need to work then. So there's small elements like that. We also still, for example, pay business mileage, even if you get in an electric car. So you actually might make a little bit, you probably get over reimbursed. The inland revenue, the tax regime here in the UK still let you do that. So we've made that very clear. So get yourself an electric car, you can still claim your mileage. So there's small elements like that we can put in, and then obviously what sits behind it is perhaps some more strict rules on thou shalt not do it this way, to sort of set a bottom line. So it's probably a stage process: information, incentivize, and then actually some bit firmer direction underneath.
And on our side, Patrick, I think, Peter, you're a bit ahead of us in this way. I think potentially if someone from Dentsu were to join this call, they might say that they don't have as much information about this as we've shared today. And really the reason for that is that we are getting this data right before communicating it out more widely. But I mean, in terms of incentivizing people, what we found so far is that people are actually really receptive to this. The small changes that we're asking them to make don't necessarily always need to be incentivized, as long as they have the data, the information, especially on emissions. People tend to be quite receptive about this, but of course, we will look at incentives further down the line, and some of our countries are already putting in similar measures to those that Peter referenced around electric vehicles in specific countries such as Germany.
It never ends though, Patrick, because we have got started again, and same as Natasha, we're only recently, being able to measure is actually relatively recent. So getting that information out, we only just started the information exercise, and we've got lots more to do. So my message to everyone on this call is you just need to start. You'll never think you've got all of the information, or then I will start to inform. You've almost whatever you've got, take your personnel with you on that journey, because as you learn more and you have more information and the ability to measure gets better, then you're building on information that's already out there. We don't know at this point, for example, what Natasha's ahead of us is about sustainable airlines. If we are going to fly, and obviously there will still be flights, that's more information we will learn. We'll need to get that out there. So it's just a constant process.
And I guess it's learning and then adjusting your approach, and then learning, and then that kind of agile way of working where you find the best way.
Yeah.
Okay.
But we've been given a golden opportunity by the pandemic. It's a horrible way to get a golden opportunity, but we have been given a golden opportunity to use that to show that. I mean, we wouldn't have been on this forum 2 years ago. Most people had never heard of Zoom or WebEx at that point. So, it gives us the opportunity. So people know it works. So we've got some element to build on. But it's just breaking that. The natural habit of people is, oh, the world's getting better, I'll go back to what I did before. So we have an opportunity, but it's probably, it is the golden opportunity, which will be gone if we don't act pretty quickly.
Yeah, exactly. And then staying with you, Pia, I know you mentioned about that yourself as the chairperson and CEO are both involved in the sustainability strategy for Shoosmiths. Is there anything else that your senior leaders are doing? I mean, the question's actually for Natasha that I can see from Felix about how senior leaders are endorsing the levers which Natasha spoke about. But Peter, maybe if you wanted to comment first on anything else that senior leaders within your organisation are kind of doing.
I think, as I say, I think it's visibility. I'm very lucky, and Nicola Ellen is our head of the sustainability area, and she's answering some questions because she's the real detail and knowledge. And I think you need that element. You need somebody who's in there understanding that detail. But what I can do is understanding plenty of it and get myself involved, but have that ability then to make sure it's woven in. I think the really hard part, and we're just going through a strategy review at the moment, is all of the ESG, so not just climate, but diversity, inclusion, governance, etc. All of that, there's a lot of people that put it on a website and tick the boxes. What we've got to do as leaders is demonstrate how it's woven into what we're talking about and how we do business. And I think that's the bit that leaders can make a difference. We can have all the policies in the world, but unless we show how they link in to what this business believes in, people will typically just find their way around those policies.
Yeah, just to add to that, Peter, I couldn't agree more. I mean, we're very fortunate in that our CEO, Wendy Clark, is incredibly behind this. She was the one who launched the emissions reduction target on flights last year, and she's the one who's been helping to reiterate this kind of more meaningful, more purposeful travel message throughout the business. And within our flights working group, we do have senior leadership representation from across the business. So the individuals who sit on that group do lead up large teams, and they have influence, and they are actively helping us to advocate across the business for the change that we need to see.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense that the senior leaders are involved, because they're leading by example. Then everyone automatically will become more involved. Okay, maybe just as a to finish off the panel discussion, then maybe if we can just go round the table. And if you can just provide maybe some key challenges that you've faced, or key tips for the businesses can kind of take away. If you could give one, maybe that'd be really useful. Tash, can we start with you?
Yeah, of course. So I think that the challenge that we have had is, to Peter's point, knowing that point when to communicate and when to hold back. I think he's completely right in the fact that you need to bring people on the journey, and that's really what we have tried to do, whilst also making sure that we have the data and the facts to back up the information that we're putting forward, so that we can help people to make the best decisions that they can.
Peter, yeah, over to you.
I would have said something very similar, so I'll pick something different. You do need to set a target. We've used the science-based targets, but if you don't set a target, then it's always much easier to slip away. Ultimately, if you measure it, it tends to get done. Yes, you do need to incentivize, inform, etc. But ultimately, you need to set your goals to give you that strategic direction.
Yeah,
I had to give you a plug there, Olwen. But it's absolutely necessary.
That leads nicely onto Olwen.
Yeah, I mean, I guess Peter's maybe taken my main piece of advice here, but yeah, agreed. I think, and maybe even before, the target setting process might seem daunting at first, but I think just trying to take it step by step and looking into, what data do you have currently available, looking at the Science-Based Targets Initiative submission form and seeing what you would need to get to a place to be able to submit a target, and what's the journey in between that in terms of having a more complete inventory, modeling a target, getting the internal buy-in, and then actually going through the validation process, but looking at each one at a time rather than seeing it as too much of a larger, daunting journey.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you for that, and also thank you so much for your presentations, and also to the audience for your amazing engagement. It's been great, and we've had so many questions come in. We'll try and cover as many as possible in the follow-up that we send out. Maybe if we could pull the slides back up. So on the left there, you can see that our next Reducing Scope 3 Emissions session is going to cover investments. And so as a kind of overview of this series, we've got over 8,000 registrants across all of the 9 sessions, and we've had amazing numbers of attendees. So I think it's been around 600 for both of the first two sessions, which it just displays the clear business interest in addressing Scope 3 emissions, which is really good. So, as I mentioned also earlier at the start, we've also got a human rights and climate change series running in parallel to this. The next session is a human rights with just transition on the 20th of April. So feel free to scan those QR codes and register. Just moving on to the next slides. And as I mentioned this afternoon, we've got a LGBTIQ plus the opening session in that series. So that should be a really good one. And then also on the global goals team are delivering a zero waste and circular economy session on the 31st of March. And that's going to look at that's as part of the SDG benchmark series. Okay, so with that, I will wrap it up, and I want to just thank you again to the panelists. I really enjoyed that conversation. I look forward to having you back at some point. And again, thank you to the audience for the engagement. It was a really good conversation, I think.